Thank you all for coming. I'm Nader Hashmi. I'm the director of the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at the School of Foreign Service. So this event today is part of a new initiative that we've launched here at the School of Foreign Service under the auspices of the center that I direct, called the Iran Project. The Iran Project is an informal initiative to raise the quality and quantity of discussion, programming, teaching, and research at Georgetown. It's very much an idea at this moment, and for this academic year, it simply means we're going to be organizing more events with speakers on issues that relate to contemporary Iranian politics and society. Nothing more, nothing less. That's what the Iran Project is at this moment. The Iran Project is directed by Sayed El-Sayed Ghanam, who is a visiting professor here at the School of Foreign Service. He teaches 2 courses on the Middle East, and he's here. If you have any questions about the Iran Project, you should direct it to him. He spent 4 years in the Egyptian embassy in Tehran. It left a deep impression on him, and the Iran Project is really a result of his enthusiasm, encouragement, and energy to sort of have a serious opportunity for our students to engage with the politics and society of contemporary Iran, Iran's regional politics, its international relations. We hope to work with everyone here at Georgetown who has a stake in the question of Iran, including our Persian Studies program, that is led by the hardworking Farima Sadegh Mostafi, who I don't know if she's here today or not, but I know she was there she is. She was very enthusiastic and delighted to hear that we're doing an event on recent events in Iran. So if anyone has any sort of questions about the project, what we hope to do next, what the aspirations are in terms of programming and the establishment of a certificate and a minor, El-Sayed is here to answer your questions. So the format for today is going to be that of a public conversation between Negar Mostazavi and Daniel Brumberg, followed by a question and answer session. Unfortunately, Sina Tusi could not be with us today. Negar Mostazavi is a journalist and commentator, editor, and host of the Iran podcast, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy based in Washington, D.C. She's been covering Iran and Middle Eastern affairs and U.S. foreign policy for over a decade. If you haven't listened to the Iran podcast, I strongly recommend that you do. Daniel Brumberg is the associate professor in the Department of Government here at Georgetown, a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the director of the Democracy and Governance Studies program here at Georgetown in the Department of Government, and he's a senior non-resident fellow on the Project on Middle East Democracy. Dan writes a regular column on Middle Eastern affairs in North Africa. Most recently, he wrote a very important piece that I recommend you look up for the Arab Center called "Iran's Rebellion Will Transform Iran's Republic for Better or for Worse." And just on one final sort of note, the very first event that I organized as director of the ACMCU was actually an event looking at the women life freedom protests in Iran in 2022, 1 year later. And it just so happened that we had the same 2 guest speakers here. It was a very successful event. I'm hoping that we can reproduce the quality of that event. But of course, Iran has changed significantly since the 3 of us were on stage together. So let me sit down and pose the first question to our distinguished panel. Okay, welcome back to both of you. I want you to both of you take 5 minutes and reflect for a moment on the significance and meaning of recent events in Iran in terms of the protests, the crackdown, the massacre, the threats of an American intervention. What are some of the key takeaways that you have in your own reading of this moment in post-revolutionary Iranian politics? Dan?
Well, thanks. It's great to be here, I think. I mean, we're here for somewhat other reasons, but here we are, and great to be back in Georgetown. I spent the last year at our campus in Doha, and all of 2 weeks this year in the United States. So I was not here for the multiple fireworks that all of you experienced, also including the organizing of events that require police detail. This is all sort of new for me, but I'm glad to be back home, more or less, certainly with my family and my colleagues, although back to a United States, which is in many ways worse off than it was a year ago, right? But anyway, this is not about the U.S. or not principally about the U.S. Just a few remarks to answer Nader's inquiry. We go back a long time. I used to be a guest back there in Denver, and Nader made it possible for me to come talk and see my family. So I'm always thankful for that. But from the outset of the uprising, the rebellion, the revolt, whatever you wish to call it, I was not terribly optimistic about the prospects for this succeeding and setting the stage either for the regime to collapse and or even more ambitiously some sort of democracy in its place. This has been a contest between by the way, I'm going to frame my remarks in a way that have a kind of theoretical edge to them so we can think comparatively about Iran a little bit. What does Iran have to tell us about sort of the nature of these sort of revolts and the possibilities for democratization? From the outset, it was a battle, an almost existential battle between an opposition that had nothing to lose and a regime that had everything to lose. And I think the latter is really important because over the years, we've seen this, and I've written about it over time. We've seen the Islamic Republic begin as a kind of quasi-competitive autocracy in which there were sort of multiple spaces for different elites and different groups to compete within certain boundaries. The supreme leader, starting with Khomeini, was a kind of supreme arbiter of the political arena, managed the conflicts with the elite, used various institutions, including the electoral system, to ensure the regime's survival, but allow enough of a kind of opening to let off steam. It was a very complex apparatus, and it worked in its own way to the advantage of the regime, but it also allowed certain space, and we had these periodic openings and closings. Khatami's era, and that was the last time I was in Iran, in fact, was the epitome of this. For some measure of controlled opening that actually played into the regime's favor. But this is not the least bit unusual. Iran was not unique in that regard. We've seen many variations of this kind of system in the Middle East and beyond. So I want to make that very clear, although it was administered by a certain kind of state with a certain kind of ideological fixation, if you like, but also a very powerful security sector. And a security sector, and when I say the state had everything to lose, or the ruling apparatus, the security sector is enmeshed in the economic sector and enmeshed in all vestiges of political power. And when you have a state like that, and when the security sector is pillarized, as I call it, with every element of power, including the state apparatus, there is very little chance that there's going to be a major division within the regime because there's simply too much to lose. And so when we look at possibilities for splits within regimes that are often the opening to do some sort of transition, here we have a situation in which there was, for a period, under Khatami, reformists who were linked to the regime, but increasingly over time, the regime has closed the space for competition, while those who are controlling the regime are deeply enmeshed in ideologically and economically in a structure of power that they are not willing to lose and will do everything they can to protect. And I think we've seen that. And the regime benefits from the fact that it represents a minority of Iranians in some sense. I mean, it's the classic collective action scenario in which a regime that's tightly bound, united in its ranks, able to mobilize people, its security forces in the streets, faces a dispirited, fragmented opposition, geographically, ideologically, socially. This is not the least bit unusual, but that plays into the regime's hands. And we saw that from the outset. And we saw the regime ready and willing to use whatever means necessary to overcome the opposition, including killing thousands. We don't know exactly the number. It could be a lot more than 3 or 4, and doing what it needed to survive. But the title of my article, which Nader mentioned, is that I think that to say this is the last gasp of the regime, I'm not sure what that means. But the regime has, over time, deprived itself of the mechanisms it had previously to create a certain amount of control of the political arena. And as it's folded into itself, the success of its own autocracy is its greatest liability, because it doesn't have anything other than coercion. That's all that's left. Ideology, what does it mean? You know, for its troops, it means a lot. But the country as large is disillusioned with the ideology. So it has to rely only on force. And at one point or another, when you have to do that, and there's no other political mechanisms available because you've actually basically denuded them, what is left? And I think that over time, this is the reality that is the regime faces. And I'll just summarize my point of view by saying, I'm sure we'll come back to this, that as long as the supreme leader is intact and the leader, and he holds the regime together, he's no longer the supreme arbiter, which is, I used to call him that, but he's the supreme leader in that sense. But he's very dependent on the security sector more than ever because he's got rid of other potential allies. They're no longer there, right? So who does he? When the leaders, and he's 86, he will not live forever. When the succession struggle becomes real and on the horizon, it's at that point that the meaning of this uprising will become really clear because it's going to, the memory, the reality of it will affect that succession struggle and will open it up to all kinds of possibilities. I'm not about here to speculate on whether such a struggle would open the door to democracy, but I think the two of these dynamics are linked, the uprising, the crushing of the uprising, and the succession struggle to come in Iran. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dan. So Nagar, the significance and meaning of this moment in Iran's post-revolutionary experience. This is Iran's Tiananmen Square moment in terms of the massacre, and a country doesn't emerge unscathed from that experience. So what are the big takeaways that you see from this particular moment in Iran?
Thank you so much, Nader, Jonathan, for organizing this timely event. It's great to be here back with Dan. I wish it was under better circumstances, but nevertheless, very timely. So just to add to what Dan said, I agree with the points. I think just a very quick look at the latest on the ground, thousands killed. And this is by the admission of state officials themselves. This is not just human rights activists outside the country. The state, for the first time, came out very quickly and acknowledged that thousands have been killed on the street. Although the way they're framing it is that these quote unquote terrorist elements or saboteurs, whatever you call them, were in the crowd, and these thousands of people were essentially killed by infiltrators, and they're trying to call them martyrs if they're civilians, hundreds of security forces, a very massive death toll, the highest, like you're saying, in the recent history of mass protests in the Islamic Republic. Also the highest on the side of the security forces, hundreds have been killed. So, which paints sort of the very violent, a picture of the kind of violence on the street. I've spoken to people who were eyewitnesses, present on the street, and some described the scenes as essentially a street war zone. Really, really horrific. And yes, I agree. I mean, this is yet another juncture in the history of the Islamic Republic, like previous mass protests, 2022, Women, Life, Freedom, 2019, again with an economic spark, before that, the Green Movement, that there's no going back to before. But also, as Dan was suggesting, what's ahead of us is not as clear as we see some painting it, this is their last step, or this is essentially calling it a revolution, giving this illusion that to some even on the ground that this is it. This is that they were calling it quote unquote the final battle, as if you're coming out of this with a regime collapse or regime change that's imminent, and we didn't see that happening. And what I think was interesting or different in this phase was that at the beginning, the government didn't come in with that sort of iron fist crackdown approach. In fact, when the protests started in the heart of Tehran's bazaar due to an economic policy change by the government, the devaluation of the Iranian currency, certain subsidies that had been removed in an area that, to Dan's point, has created a lot of corruption. And essentially the government's point is we want to remove these subsidies for a certain class of merchants and then redistribute the cash to the end user, to the public. And that prompted the protests initially in the bazaar, but then it spread like wildfire to cities and towns across the country, and people joined from all walks of life. And it was no longer just economics or specific policy. It was targeting. If you see the slogans and also the conduct of how people are in the street, like Dan is saying, who seem to feel like they have nothing to lose, essentially putting their lives on the street. attacking the very core of the system. And at the heart of it, even if we look at it from an economic perspective, is the fact that life in Iran, the status quo, the economy is not working for the majority of Iranians, for middle class, working class Iranians who've gotten poorer. Life, conditions have just become worse and worse in a country that is sort of dealing with this triangle of mismanagement, of a lot of corruption, domestic, so these internal, and then also very severe economic sanctions. Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, and it's been isolated economically, financially, and that has delivered, of course, with policies on the ground, sort of this economy that's not working for most Iranians. While at the same time, as Dan also mentioned, there is an elite for whom the economy has actually worked really perfectly. The Qasaban Tahrim, sanctions, profiteer, this class that has been created either of regime or regime adjacent officials, people with connections in the system for whom this economy, this system has worked. It's worked really well. And I think that also adds another layer of anger, which makes this very political to the people on the street, understanding that, okay, this is not working for most of us, but it is working for some of us. And how is that possible? And so I think, just to sort of sum it up and take a big picture view, this is going to, we're going to see more and more of these cycles. Maybe this didn't lead to a regime collapse or a regime change. In fact, I think this will harden the position of the most hardline elements of the regime. We already see, we saw the crackdown within just 2 days, very deadly, and the state has a monopoly on violence, on arms. And they're willing and capable of essentially doing what it takes to end these protests in a very brutal and deadly way, but they did, as they have done before. So I think we're going to see more and more of these mass protests, because unless the grievances are addressed, unless people see an improvement in their lives, they're just going to pile up and every time come out angrier. And I think that's that level of raw anger that we saw on the street was also what made it so different. When people ask me, how was it different than last time or the time before? I'm like, everyone is just so much more angrier because it keeps piling up. 2022, 19, 2009, all of these mass protests, every time we see people coming back out with more anger and more hopelessness. So I think this is going to be one of those junctures that will have an impact. Unfortunately, I think it will be more securitization of the space. We're already hearing from political activists, civil society on the ground who are being pressured, being called in for interrogations, essentially saying that they're put on notice, and a closing of that political space. And maybe we can talk about this after, but this all also comes in the aftermath of a war, of an actual war, a military attack from the outside in June. I think that also has a lot of impact on what's happening on the ground. We can talk about.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there was the 12-day June war last June. And one of the surprising things that happened was that, notwithstanding the Israeli and then American attack and calls from the Prime Minister of Israel for Iranians to overthrow the regime, that didn't happen. There was a very clear rally around the flag effect, a deep sense of patriotism, which the regime exploited by sort of drawing upon pre-Islamic sort of themes of nationalism. And there was a sense that, the regime had benefited from that attack, that there was a sense of, look, 1,000 people were killed, many of them innocent civilians. The Islamic Republic had weathered a storm. What struck me about this particular moment is it's pretty clear looking back, that was just a fleeting moment, because when the currency collapsed and the inflation skyrocketed, people poured into the streets in numbers that were quite surprising. And so the legitimacy that the regime, whatever small bump in legitimacy that the regime benefited from after the 12-day war, clearly that was old news, and it no longer applies. So let me ask you, Nagar, were you surprised by how quickly the protest took off and sort of became sort of a mass movement that, manifested itself in sort of the crackdown, the internet shutdown, and then regime repression? And I'm asking specifically to contrast, basically end of December with mid-June in Iran. It seems like there was a major shift in terms of public opinion.
This is a great point. And I think ironically or tragically also, more people, so many more, thousands of more people were killed in these protests and the crackdown than in the June war, because that was that number, over 1,000 Iranians killed, most of them civilian, women, children. That was the number that they were leading with. And then comes 6 months later, something that tops that by many more. Yes, so exactly as you said, I call it a rally around the homeland sort of effect, not necessarily around the flag, because no love lost for a state by still the same demographics of people even after the June war. But I think what we saw this time was essentially what the Israelis were envisioning for June. And it didn't happen because we saw these statements and sort of wishes or hopes of a regime collapse, of imminent protests or riots happening while the war is being launched on Iran, with Israel attacking and then the US joining. And we did not see even one protest, like one person coming out to riot or topple the regime or etc. Even though the Israelis were pushing for that very much, also with online campaigns of disinformation, AI, all of that, which is another very interesting layer. But I think this was what was envisioned, but what was lacking back then was this real element of organic mass protests on the street, a crowd that comes with a spark, with a reason, angry, with grievances. And it happened in December. So the June war, I think, sort of showed that that Iranians, and I've talked to a lot of people who were on the ground during that war, all walks of life, pro, against, in between, on the fence. And it really united, I would say, Iranians in an opposition to that kind of a military threat or military attack, and made people a little more clear-eyed about what this kind of foreign-imposed military attack is going to look like. You know, essentially, quote-unquote, freedom bombs, how the Israelis have promised to come and, you know, only target the regime, only target their assets, only the nuclear program. And what you see happening in reality is that even when they're going for officials, regime, or nuclear scientists, they kill their family, they kill the neighbors, civilian infrastructure was attacked, and many people who were really not part of the fight lost their lives. So I think after that, this sort of rally around the homeland and that clear-eyed vision of what an actual war or foreign military attack is going to look like. But then now with these protests, and then we can talk about also maybe the foreign threats from President Trump during these protests and how that changed or didn't change the dynamic. I think there's, again, this understanding that, yes, there's an outside threat and then there's this inside threat, and we're essentially caught between a rock and a hard place. And it doesn't mean that you have an affinity for one or the other if you oppose both. And I think that's kind of sort of the nuance or the discourse that we're also missing in a lot of the conversations that now we're hearing from the diaspora, because Iranians also have been cut from the internet for almost 2 weeks, a very severe blackout of communication. So it's hard to also paint a very clear picture of what exactly happened on the ground. Images are scarce, eyewitnesses are just coming. But the discourse we're hearing right now, a lot of it in the diaspora, I think, is lacking that nuance, that you don't have to support one or the other. You can just feel like you're caught between these two rock and hard place.
Yeah, Dan, you mentioned the theme of coercion. And it seems like that's the only sort of card that the Islamic Republic has to play right now. The prospects for a political opening or for giving people a stake in some sort of reimagined political open space seems, in my view, to be nil. And then the economic prospects are even worse, because there's no chance that I can see in the short term of these sanctions being lifted. And so, given your study of comparative politics, regimes that rely exclusively on coercion eventually sow the seeds of their own destruction. I mean, that seems to be the sort of prognosis for this particular political system in Iran. Is that your reading as well?
Well, I mean, it depends on how coercion works. I mean, the Communist Party in China is very coercive, but it has a formal institution that has survived and reestablished.
Yeah, no, they had economic incentives to the population. Iran doesn't have that.
Incentive. And I think the economic issue is really what distinguishes this moment from it. I mean, every time there's a rebellion, would say this is the time is different. Well, the time is different, and it's not different. There were many things that were different, and there are many things that were the same, right? And so it's not an either or proposition. But the extent of the economic crisis is different. And just to backtrack for a moment on the previous questions, I think the regime obviously felt that what it had to do was blame outside forces. and use them as a pretext. And if it's true that Bibi Netanyahu and his crew and our president's crew actually thought there was a chance to bring down the regime and said this. This is the ironic thing was, if anything, such claims reinforced the regime, played completely into the hands of the regime. So either the advisors in the White House and in Jerusalem are really stupid, I mean, when you think about it, and I was on Al Jazeera the other day, half-an-hour talk show on Iran, and I said, you don't need a young Iranian to go to Tel Aviv to get trained in how to burn up a car. There's a lot of angry people out there, and I think this. And then it's interesting. Professor Kadivar, always confusing with his father, illustrious Ali Kadivar, illustrious family. I actually know his father too. Had a great piece a few weeks ago. He said this rebellion is led by young, angry men, who are fed up and are willing to use violence. So maybe they were encouraged partly by outside propaganda and but the stupidity of our president, if I may say so. Thank you very much. But I mean, we'll come to your rescue. This is the Obama red line part 2, right? And no rescue, right? Of course, not only no rescue, this regime is going to use those words to do everything it can. So in some sense, if there's a retrenchment and the closing of the regime, outside interference of any kind actually accelerates this. And this is the situation we're dealing with.
So one of the things that's perplexing to me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is, we have reports. I don't trust the numbers that are coming out of Tehran, obviously, but clearly there were hundreds of state security soldiers, operatives who were killed in this uprising. And what's perplexing to me is the average citizen does not have access to weapons. There's only one scenario, I don't want to share it with you right now because I want to draw you out on this, that would explain the large numbers of state security forces who were killed at this particular moment. How do you explain that, Nagar?
No, yeah. Tell us. We'll answer your question after you tell us. Yeah.
What's your explanation? Who killed these people? I mean, they died mostly from gunfire. Where did they get the guns?
So yeah, this is also yet another difference between this round and past protests, especially 2022, which I would say the starkest difference, because the core of that was a social feminist issue. This is after Mahsa Amini, with women leading, even girls at some point, and it couldn't be any more different. Like Dan was also saying, and I agree with Ali Kadivar, angry young men with sort of the sense of, I have nothing to lose because things can't get any worse than this, possibly. And the difference, I think this time we saw that there was a clear sort of involvement from the outside. And like Dan is saying, we're not making this up. You had Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State of the United States, former head of CIA, tweeting that behind every Iranian protester, there's a Mossad agent. I don't even know if that's humanly possible, but when you do that, it has consequences. This is read in Tehran. This is, taken seriously as an excuse or as a belief. You're essentially painting every protester as a collaborator of whoever's behind them as a Mossad agent. And that, I think, impacts sort of the crackdown, especially in the second phase of the protest, because at the beginning, the government was trying to even negotiate, meet with the leaders in the bazaar, sort of keep an open space. It didn't look like this, a war zone in the first phase. And then in the second phase, when these statements started coming out from Israeli officials, from US officials, from the president saying the US is locked and loaded if protesters get killed. And then later he's asked, what happened? Protesters are being killed. And he said, oh, there was a stampede and they died in a stampede and we don't know who to hold responsible for that. So I would say this sort of both the rhetoric from the outside and also what we saw as evidence on the ground, although I don't want to, it's on the Iranian state to provide the evidence for whatever they're claiming, fact-finding missions. It's very limited access of the media and all of that. So it's for them to put out this evidence and explain what exactly happened in this communications shutdown. But yes, we see this high number, the highest number of security forces being killed, and the raw anger on the street. And sort of the general picture that I've heard from people who were on the ground or analysts who explain is that they were these pockets of saboteurs. And like Dan is saying, they don't need to go to Tel Aviv to be trained. You just need to be a little organized and a little violent and have a plan. But then a large sea of an angry crowd in every city, in every town, who is willing to join in and get involved in this kind of violence. So you just need one person to go into a mosque, start the fire, and then 100 angry people to join them. Lots of mosques were set on fire beyond just the regular, trash can or a car stuff. Very systematic destruction. Haunting or killing of these forces that are seen also as launching sort of the same level of violence, deadly violence against the protesters. And we also see that what I think was disturbing, the rhetoric of justifying this violence online in the diaspora among known influencers or social cultural figures, essentially saying this is what you're supposed to do. The security forces are killing you. You need to kill them as well. And I think that's what has created sort of this difference, this stark difference. But
it still raises the question: where do they get the guns from? Dan, do you have any reading
Well,
on this?
I have no intelligence to reveal on that particular issue. I have to say, given what Pompeo said, he's about the best ally that the regime has. When you make those kinds of statements, it's incredibly stupid. But no one should in any way underestimate the capacity of our leaders to go in that direction. But I would say that, first of all, in other rebellions, there have been attacks on police. Nothing on this level. It's unprecedented. But in these kind of, for every kind of rebellion, things develop in a unique way, in ways that we don't fully understand. We can only speculate. We can come up with hypotheses, but we need empirical evidence. We'll get Ali to do it because he's the kind of guy who does this. But, where the violence, who died, under what circumstances, the more rural you get, the more opportunities there probably are for access to weapons. There's a lot of things going on. It could have been, one could imagine there could have been some fissures in the regime and some, and some of these weapons got out. Who knows? But all I would say is that under the conditions in which it's an opposition was everything to nothing to lose in a regime that has everything to hold on to. Any outside sort of effort to accelerate the conflict immediately plays into the regime's hand. So that's
Dan, on that point, though, even if Mike Pompeo shut his mouth, even if all of these, people in the MAGA Republic, they said absolutely nothing. There was zero encouragement. The playbook of authoritarian repression always blames domestic uprisings on external influence, whether it's visible, apparent, or not. So, that raises the question, yes, these statements by Pompeo and others are stupid, but I don't think it would actually change how a repressive regime responds. They would still do it.
And if you're involved in an elaborate scheme from outside to arm certain elements and so on, you don't start bragging about it. What kind of strategy is that?
It doesn't make.
And I also want to point to the inconsistency. So we have the U.S. president saying we're locked and loaded if you kill the protesters. Within a week, he says the Iranians have reached out. I'm going to set up a meeting. So suggesting diplomacy. Then changes his mind again and says all meetings called off. They need to stop executions. And then he says, oh, they've stopped executions. So I've decided to not intervene. And then again, within 2 weeks, telling Iranians, keep occupying your institutions. Help is on the way, sort of in a third person format now. It's unclear what kind of help, who's bringing it, but it's on the way. If you're a protester on the ground, sort of putting your hopes in these tweets or truth socials coming from the U.S. president, what are you to make of that in a span of 2 weeks? But we still want to hear your scenario.
Yeah, we're waiting.
My scenario is this. Actually, Dan alluded to it.
Later.
My scenario is this: if it's difficult to get accurate information because of the blackout, but if it is proven that a lot of these security forces were killed in the Kurdish part of Iran,
yes,
where the borders are porous, then that would make sense that there would be, large numbers of stakes. If it was happening in other parts, not the rural areas, but the major cities, that's shocking. So that's the one scenario where I can see this sort of, happen. But this raises the question, and this is maybe the most difficult question I'm going to ask you, Dan, to try and interpret for us what Trump is thinking about his Iran policy.
You want me to get into Trump's head?
Well,
the Wall Street Journal said he needs a therapist. Okay. I mean, finally, some folks are recognizing what we're dealing with.
No, but what's happening right now is clearly this moment of what seemed to be an imminent American attack has receded. But the sort of the second part of the story is Trump is beefing up American military assets in the region.
Yes.
And given that the social conditions that produce this moment will likely reproduce another possible uprising or crisis moment with American assets in the region, that would sort of give Trump more options theoretically to strike Iran, which then raises the question, would he do it? What consequences would that have on domestic Iranian politics? And so how do you see sort of the Trump Iran policy playing itself out in the next few months?
If you have a coercive strategy which is tied to some sort of diplomatic strategy, that's one thing. I mean, that's a game of chicken. You use your assets. I was just in Doha for the year. You say we're emptying out the troops out of the bases. You send all the signals, but behind that is this idea of negotiation. And I think, by the way, and I saw multiple signals from Israel too. There was, it wasn't easy to get the read on what was going on there. From the top, you could get the read, but there was a lot of debate about what are we doing and what are the risks. But I think that for Trump, there was always this bravado of threat. But he's a man who brings extreme narcissism and extreme pragmatism together in a way that has unprecedented sort of effects on the presidency. And I think his preference would be to negotiate, but he's not willing to give up his bottom line on the enrichment issue. So there's no opening for negotiation. But what I called in my piece, the kind of neo-Venezuela scenario is you find some sort of interlocutors in the regime to speak to, which under these circumstances in Iran is impossible. But you find a way to negotiate, because to get drawn into another war with Iran at this point, so it's playing a very dangerous game by building up its troop strength and so on, with the threat without a viable diplomatic alternative behind it. That's the really dangerous part.
And speaking of diplomacy, my reading is there's no prospects of it in the near term. How do you read the prospects of diplomacy with Trump?
It would only exist if one side or the other were willing to find some sort of quasi-symbolic formula on the enrichment issue. I mean, this is a highly technical issue, but the United States has always said zero enrichment. And after Israel and the United States attacked Iran's nuclear sites, it seems that a lot of it was destroyed, but a lot of the enriched uranium was retained. So Iran is on a 2 or 3 year path to rebuilding without any UN supervision, without outside. It's thrown out the UN and all the inspectors and everything else. But if the United States were willing to come up with a formula on the issue of enrichment, because Iran's perspective is, and I understand from their point of view, we're not giving up enrichment. Actually, there's no technical right to enrichment, but there's no technical right that you can't enrich. So if there were a formula for that, but I just find it very hard to see how Trump, being the one who walked away from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, is going to be the guy to negotiate with Iran. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right about that.
Hagar?
Yeah, can I add on that? I agree with Dan. I feel like the path to diplomacy, as we saw it succeed one time under Barack Obama in the past 4 decades of U.S.-Iran animosity, that was the only time there was a difference, delivered to JCPOA. You have the carrot and the stick. And I feel like for this president, there's the stick, and then the carrot is the non-existent of the stick. So there isn't a carrot. I don't even know if he's prepared to do that kind of real, structure for diplomacy. And the other problem when you talk to the Iranians from their viewpoint is that the goalpost kept changing. So I think the president has been pretty consistent in wanting a deal with Iran. I mean, that's his whole spiel. He wants to make the better deal than Barack Obama. His problem wasn't that the U.S. made a deal. It was that he didn't make it. And he's going to come and one-up Obama and make the best deal. And he's been consistent. The first time, the second time. I mean, he's done everything that's, if you ask me how you get a deal with Iran, this is what you're supposed to do. Like, this is the opposite of how you get a deal with Iran. But I think in his mind and his wish is that he wants this betterly, and he thinks with coercion or with maximum pressure, this is the path that would lead to it. But for the Iranians in the second term of the Trump administration, they finally agreed to come to negotiations, these indirect talks. Initially, the point coming from the president was that no nuclear weapons, just they just can't have weapons. And the Iranians said, okay, we agree to that structure. That's something we've been saying. Let's negotiate. And then the goalposts started to move throughout these rounds of talks to no enrichment, zero enrichment, which is no civilian program, which is a major red line for the Iranians. And they were like, wait a minute. And then came the airstrikes by the Israelis, and then the US joined in. So it's just very chaotic as far as how he wants to get from point A to Z by, zigzagging between military coercion, maximum pressure, but then again back to diplomacy.
And what
I
is
think is
the
what he
incentive
wants.
to negotiate? He already got the Nobel Peace Prize. It was handed to him in the White House the other day. No, I mean, I mean, it's funny and
Well, the incentive is he can say, I stopped another international crisis.
Yes, yeah.
I've got nine. I
just think there's no, my opinion is there's no rationality in this man. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
But just from an American sort of geostrategic position, do you both agree that time is on the side of the United States? It's not on the side of Iran. Iran has it's been boxed in. Its axis of resistance effectively collapsed, has no economic prospects. There's no chance of internal political reform. So you just wait until, the regime cries uncle, and then you strike a deal. I mean, that would seem to me to be the very cold, calculated sort of realpolitik position. You just wait it out until, you get a message from Tehran that, look, we're willing to concede something that Trump or whoever's in the White House can claim as a victory. That seems like the rational scenario that's going to play itself out. What do you think, Dan?
well, I mean, I think that's a very good point. The reimposition of snapback sanctions, which played a role in the uprising and the devaluation of the currency, that's not going to get any better. I mean, the diplomatic path is through some sort of deal, right? That in some way or other restores Iran's place in the national economic sort of order, as such as it is these days, and because under conditions of sanctions, the real players, the real cost is the middle class. I mean, the regime can leverage sanctions and over time and enrich itself, but the middle class is increasingly beleaguered and unable to respond. So, but that would require readiness of Trump to kind of pull an Obama too. The man everything that I used to feel that everything that Obama did, everything that Trump did was about not doing what Obama did and rejecting it in so many ways. So I find it hard to believe, but you're right. I mean, given the current economic circumstances, what are the alternatives?
Yeah.
The sanctions aren't going away. And the Iranian government played their hands very badly on that. I think they made the situation unnecessarily worse. But so yes, wait it out and see what happens. Yes.
Just one last question to both of you, and then we'll turn it to the audience. If you look at the history of, Iranian politics, the Islamic Republic post 1979, whenever the regime faces a crisis moment that challenges its stated political and ideological position, it compromises in order to survive. So the Iran-Iraq war, Iran said it wouldn't compromise. The war drags on. They're forced to sign a peace deal because things are sort of unraveling. The nuclear program, Iran didn't want to compromise. Sanctions are intensified. They have to enter the negotiations. They signed the JCPOA, effectively giving up their nuclear program with, a promise for sanction release that doesn't happen. And
they even had a name for it. He called it heroic flexibility.
Heroic flexibility. They justified
and
it.
The Iran-Iraq war, the ceasefire was called drinking a chalice of poison.
So they justify, but it's clearly those are words of they had to concede. And then most dramatically is on one of the core pillars of the Islamic Republic, the question of the status of women and their presence in the public sphere, giving up on the, hijab law, not de jure, but de facto, effectively conceding that point because they know coercion won't work. So if you see that, it would suggest to me that eventually, in order to survive, given what's happened now, the regime would have to make some similar dramatic concession to Trump in order to open up a path where the system can continue. What that will look like, I don't know, but I suspect it would have something to do with conceding their nuclear program in exchange for sanction relief. That's my reading of how things are going to go. Dan, what do you think?
Well, I mean, maybe Khomeini drank the chalice of poison in his last year, right? I mean, and it set the stage for all kinds of things in terms of the succession. And I suppose one could imagine, Khamenei has always been a pragmatist. I mean, he's deeply ideologically invested, but the man has been very astute his entire life because he's a revolutionary pragmatist, right? So I can imagine a scenario whereby, he might say, you know what? I'm not here forever. Look, I'm getting more frail. I want to set a succession scenario that works for me, and I'm not saying his son is going to succeed him. I don't think so. But whatever happens, and because I want this, because the one thing that Iran has that the Shah didn't have is institutions. People forget about that. It learned a lot from the fall of the Shah, and that was Khomeini's great gift to the Islamic Republic: actual institutions. So how do you make those institutions thrive? And I could see maybe Khamenei deciding, well, you know what? Maybe I have to find some sort of formula on this enrichment thing. There were all kinds of solutions that were being floated before, if you remember, on this issue. And my last gift is, some sort of deal. And then we live to see another day.
Just to add to your point, I think this is so correct. And unfortunately, sometimes we get analysis that's the opposite of that the system is so rigid, they're not going to give an inch because if they think if they show any flexibility, they have to go all the way. And that's not what's happened over the years, with the issue of, like you said, from the 1980s, the war, the nuclear deal, and in between smaller issues. There was a time when owning a satellite dish, I remember a time living in Iran when owning a satellite dish was illegal. I don't think that law has changed on paper. It was never announced that, we failed, this is good. But now you go on a rooftop in any city in Iran and it's just littered. All buildings are littered with satellite dishes. They just gave up. And I think on the issue of hijab also, after the 2022 protests, we really saw sort of a dramatic shift that was coming over the years of resistance of women fighting back this dress code. But we saw that shift, and essentially the system giving up that control because of the kind of pressure that was coming. And this time, I think, and we see indications that they want to. I mean, parts of the system, the Pezeshkian government, administration, whatever, see this high level of corruption, how the economy is not working for their own constituents, people who voted them into these elected positions. But this is not like hijab. This is not a domestic issue. The Iranian economy is not going to improve a lot without fixing sort of that whole foreign policy file, because one major underlying aspect of this is sanctions. Yes, you can fix corruption as much as you want, crack down on everyone, mismanagement, you can manage this, but without sort of resolving that issue. And that has to come from diplomacy, from negotiations, and from shifting the direction of the country's foreign policy, nuclear policy, regional presence, and making that decision essentially for the leaders is, do you want a continuation of all of these policies, or do you want better economic improvement? And so far, I haven't seen that, but I think that's sort of the direction that also the public, a big core of the population, is pushing for, that we can't live like this anymore, no matter how you justify your foreign policy.
Okay, it's 1:00 right now. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So we have a microphone here. Raise your hand. I just remind everyone, please ask a pointed question. We're not going to take speeches, but I'll give you time to articulate a question that's relevant to the topic that brings us here. I'll say it.
Thank you so much for your insight. Admittedly, the deteriorating economic situation served as demotivation behind the protests. I guess my question is, to what extent is the domestic factor is positively correlated with the reputational cost that Iran has suffered in its power projection posture, specifically after the fall of the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, and the 12-day war? More concretely, what is the change and continuity in debating foreign policy issues on the agenda of the Iranians? If I may just add one point for Dan, you have underscored the centrality of survival in the regime's tendencies. How could we reconcile survival with the resolve that the regime has been demonstrating? Vali Nasser spoke about the grand strategy of Iran in terms of independence? Iran as a state, not necessarily the regime as the unit of analysis. Thank you.
Yes, Iran's grand strategy means something very different after this moment than it did before this crisis. I think everything is being reconsidered, and it's unclear what happens next. What's your read, Dan?
Well, the axis of resistance, so-called, which has now been sort of decimated,
Right.
was always based on a formula which was no peace, no war. We're not, and the Israelis and the Americans called them on that formula. So that doesn't work anymore. Is your question in terms of the implications of the regional events for the debate in Iran about? I mean, and we heard a lot of, the sloganeering, that in reference to the Palestinian issues and so on. And I think Iranians know that, this regime has leveraged that issue and as much as it possibly can as part of its regime survival strategy. And now that the deck has been completely reshuffled in the region, and that's even more exposed. So I think it's going to just be much harder for to leverage those sort of issues for the regime going forward, given the situation in the region. It just doesn't have the assets, and so the emperor wears no clothes in that sense. So that just has it, much more relying on its own internal regime survival in any way it possibly can. We can speculate about the role of Russia and China and working with Iran or whatever, and that's a whole different or related subject. But I think that that the regional equation has really sort of once again limited the regime. And also, a quick point here. I mean, if Khamenei sets the stage for his own succession, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that could open up space for the return into the regime of voices that have now been excluded. We don't know. Iran has a way of surprising us, which is always the story of Iran. So, but right now the regional equation has really limited the ability of, and actually sort of works to the favor of those oppositionists say, what, this has always been sort of an excuse for repressing the regime, and we're not gonna tolerate it anymore.
Next question or comment, just raise your hand and just on your other, right. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Whoever you identify, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dan, Nagar, thank you for your time. Appreciate the talk. I think we'd all like to imagine that if the regime were to topple, that meant a free and prosperous Iran where folks had self-determination and could determine what comes next for their country. I'm increasingly worried about this sort of sense of we're returning back to like a global world order of carving up spheres of influence where big superpowers, the United States, China, Russia, sort of get to determine, they get certain areas of the globe. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to comment on what it looks like for all the other actors involved, those three nations, the Israelis, the Saudis, perhaps, what comes next in a vacuum of power if the regime does topple and we don't get that perfect outcome of a free and prosperous, self-determined Iran. What does that look like?
Iranian colleague, who jump into this first.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, it's hard for me, is everything that we talked about, to envision a path to that, at least in the short term. But if I want to talk about what's already happened from the reaction of the neighbors, and this ties into that to the U.S. response or comments from President Trump, we know one of the reasons for sort of having second thoughts is that the neighbors started lobbying him really hard. The Arabs, Arab monarchies across the Persian Gulf who care about stability, their own economic trade situation, any form of chaos is going to impact them. They lobbied him really hard, the Saudis, particularly Qataris, Omanis, to not do this, to not, engage in a military confrontation with Iran. And the Iraqis are the neighbors. They're worried when Iran and Israel engaged. It literally physically goes above their head. They have their own internal issues with the militias, the Shia militias that are close to Iran. If they ever get involved, they didn't in June, but it doesn't always stay like that. They can potentially. join forces. So whatever's remained of the axis of resistance also still can be a concern. And the Turks even, we heard the Turks even lobbied the president because if you get another Syria in that region, in a country that's so much more populated, where did the war refugees from Syria go? To Turkey. I mean, in June, we even saw when they talked about evacuating Iran or certain cities, Iranians I know who had the means, fled to Turkey in just the 12-day war. So imagine if a scenario as catastrophic as Syria or Libya. So my question when people talk about help from the outside or foreign intervention, bringing democracy or this transition to better governance in Iran, my question is how? Show me one example. Is it Iraq? Is it Afghanistan? Is it Syria? Is it Libya? Where exactly did that work? And what kind of help do you want from the skies that can help you in this transition? So I think that worry, and then also with the Israelis, because the Iranians this time threaten very seriously that if they get attacked, they're going to hit everyone, basically. Everyone's going to be a target, U.S. forces, the Arabs, the Israelis themselves. And I think that really sort of scared, and we saw later reporting that the Israelis were telling the U.S., don't start an attack if you're not going to be there to defend us after, because what happened in June, it caused a lot of pain. I mean, initially the Israelis had the upper hand, but then the Iranians regrouped and they were able to shoot missiles into Israel and cause a lot of pain. And this time they promised that it would be much, much worse. And I think if they see an existential threat coming, they're willing to go suicidal, basically. And that's ballistic or suicidal model can look very, very different from what we saw in June. So I think these are all considerations. It's what worries the neighbors. And why the reason why we saw the lobbying, and also sort of this second thought, like Dan was saying, a pragmatic, what did you call him? Narcissist and pragmatist.
Pragmatist and narcissist.
Narcissist, yeah, the combination, very rare. But yeah, I think these all were sort of weighing in that decision. That can still come, but so far we've seen a pause.
You know, on the day that Israel tried to assassinate Hamas leaders, in the moment I was just getting my dialogue class going. Can you imagine the scenario?
In Doha?
In Doha, and we got the phone rang, and and we left our classes and so on. But it's important to remember that the assassination attempt did not succeed.
Which assassination are you referring to?
The Israeli attempt to assassinate Hamas leaders in Doha.
When they
Oh, that was
attacked
right.
Doha.
September.
I'm
It's
sorry,
September,
it
yeah.
They attacked Doha.
September.
I'm beginning to lose my train of thought here. I'm sorry. Yes, and I was in class, and then the point is that Trump ended up negotiating with the very leader that Israel tried to assassinate to get the deal. So Trump is not pro-Israeli. He's not pro-Qatar, although he's very close to Qatar. He's pro-him. I mean, that's the essence of the man. And it makes it very hard to know what a foreign policy looks like other than the expression of power and domination. And what he wants is, why did he negotiate with the very leader that Bibi tried to kill, and then get Bibi in the White House to call the Qataris and say, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I mean, what a humiliation. Trump loves to humiliate people. So he wants to subordinate them. He wants to control them. He wants to dominate the region. So what this means strategically is a big open question, because he wants to dominate, but he also would prefer to avoid war if he can. So how that plays out is anybody's guess.
I just want to add one more thing on war. He likes what we've seen is he likes the in and out, one-off sort of operation that he can easily call not war. This wasn't a war. I'm not starting wars. I'm ending wars. I'm doing one decisive thing. The brand is peace through strength. And we've seen examples, the assassination of Soleimani, one strike. The targeting of the Iranian nuclear programs, he both said it was done in 45 minutes. Not even an hour. He doesn't have, I don't think there's some, or Venezuela is a one-time operation. And I just I don't see a formula for a one-time operation regime change that he can do for Iran. So maybe, I don't know, something kinetic, something that shows power, but he's already done that.
You mentioned this in your piece, Dan, a dramatic sort of decapitation strike on Iran's supreme leader, and then the Venezuela scenario kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, the Israelis have probably decided against that, and I don't think the U.S. has the capacity to pull that off. We've done the helicopter in Tehran scenario before. That didn't work out. Yeah, I worked with the former president.
That was a long time ago.
That was a long time ago.
People were born.
Yes, President Carter, with whom I worked for 2 years at the Carter Center. Seems like a million years ago already. But so what are our options here? You're exactly right. I mean, hit them once, demonstrate strength, intimidate people, bully people, but this doesn't add up to much of a strategy, does it?
Another question, Jonathan? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. I think this was very balanced compared to other Iran panels that I've attended this week. My question is about the diaspora. What role do they play and how unified are they?
Nagar, that's for you.
Well, I mean, we have police presence here. This speaks to the situation of the diaspora. Unfortunately, the voices, and thank you so much for your comment. I think a group of sort of journalists, analysts, academics who are trying to bring some sense and nuance and context to this conversation are getting smeared, attacked, threatened. It's just very sad, but it speaks to the situation of the diaspora also. There's no unity. Unfortunately, there's no unity in the diaspora. I think there's a unity as far as anger, as far as feeling a sense of solidarity among the mainstream, the everyday person of the diaspora. When you talk about the political factions, the various different political factions, and one figure that has been really talked about and prominent is the former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. Even within his own camp, there's division. So you have the monarchists, the constitutional monarchists, the transition to democracy, but through a king or a crown sort of figure. And they're all attacking each other. And with other factions of the diaspora, I don't want to say all factions are attacking the other, but there are certain factions with more, totalitarian or authoritarian sort of views of politics and sort of trying to eliminate, it'll be like either you submit to our camp or you can't exist or you can't talk or you need to be silenced or sort of pushed out of this political discourse. Another, you've experienced that. I'm curious to hear what you think, but it's very fractured and divided.
Yeah, see, I'm going to present a different take on this. So one of the, I think, positive things that emerged out of the Women, Life, Freedom protest movement in 2022 was its resonance within the Iranian diaspora around the world. What you saw for the first time is huge numbers of people who previously weren't politicized, who didn't attend demonstrations, coming together in huge numbers around the cause of women, life, freedom, and democracy and gender equality in Iran. So just to cite one example, there was one protest, I believe, in October of 2022 in Berlin, where there was 100,000 people who showed up. It was a lot of Germans and Europeans, but a lot of Iranians. So you saw that type of mass mobilization. So my family's in Toronto. A lot of my family members who previously weren't involved in politics showed up at those protests, and they were really sort of inspired. But this was a moment where, we would come together, and it was people from different backgrounds and ideological currents. That moment seems to have passed. The moment right now that we're seeing is understandably, people in the Iranian diaspora just outraged over the massacres and the treatment of innocent protesters and the frustration over the state of politics in Iran and the understandable desire for people to want to see an end to this 47-year, increasingly authoritarian and now tyrannical regime. So I draw a distinction between 2022 and now. Things in 2022 seem to be a lot more inclusive, a lot more democratic, a lot more thoughtful, a lot more interested in supporting an internal struggle for democracy. Now what you're seeing is understandably a lot of anger and frustration and desire for retribution, and they're just praying that Donald Trump will come to the rescue of the people of Iran, which you can understand on an emotional level, but it's not really a political strategy, as you said a moment ago, because one struggles in recent years to think about an American or Western intervention in the region that has produced positive results for the people of the region, right? And so the likely scenario of an American military strike would be to create state collapse and more sort of, I think chaos and disorientation rather than a smooth transition to democracy, which is what I've been arguing for and fighting for. And to do that, that requires a lot of preconditions. And one of the preconditions is, there has to be some sort of unified democratic opposition and leadership that comes around a common program. And this is, I think, the challenge of the Iranian diaspora, right? I tend to make a distinction between my parents' generation and my generation, although, I'm getting up there in age, so there's a younger generation that's coming up behind me. There has to be an ability of Iranians from different backgrounds to come together in the spirit of not just democracy, but political pluralism and respect. And my politics is I completely reject the politics of violent military coercion for coming up from the outside, thinking that's going to create. It's got to come through nonviolent, social grassroots organizing, cross-ideological coalition building, and a long-term strategy. There's no quick fix here, right? A lot of Iranians want Trump to sort of magically, transform Iran into a democracy. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for many reasons. One, because Trump isn't a Democrat. There's an assumption here that this authoritarian president that we have is the answer to Iran's democratic woes. So there's a lot of work that has to get done. My own view is that I put a lot of more faith in the younger generation, those Iranians who are intolerant of other political persuasions and don't have a serious track record commitment to democracy and human rights. I'm very skeptical of their politics.
And in the past, with these regime change wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, there was that promise of, this is democracy, this is nation building, women's rights. But now it isn't. It's all mass love. Look at Venezuela. It was just decapitation of the top person, and the rest of the regime may continue.
Yeah, no, it's a dark moment. Let's take maybe one or two questions and then wrap it up. One question going once. Okay, there's a hand there. Okay.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. I have two questions, completely different than the other. My first question is, if not Pahlavi, then who? That's a question I have. And the second question is related to the diaspora and how the families and individuals are suffering with not being able to communicate with their loved ones over there. I spoke with a friend yesterday evening who lives in Canada, and he tells me that the last time his family logged into WhatsApp was January 8th, and then just pains him to see that he has no way to communicate with them. So what I wanted to know is, I'm really uninformed about this, and I wanted to know, what are the strategies, or what is the hope, and what are people doing when they are abroad and trying to learn how their loved ones are doing? Thank you so much.
Can I take the second question first? Thank you for that question. Yes, the communications blackout has been absolutely, daunting on people both inside the country, but also those of us, we all have family WhatsApp groups, and it's been almost 2 weeks where you see the message has only been delivered to the cousins who live abroad, and nobody from the inside has, whatever, dozens of family members. The message has not even been delivered to their device, let alone be read. And I have family and friends, loved ones inside Iran. People, there's slow trickling in with VPNs, with some specific tools, or people may have access through work. Some have access to Starlink, not necessarily as political activists, but a very small population were also able to buy Starlink, but you have to be of a certain wealth. And so it's became, at some point last week, we found one person who had access to Starlink, who would literally take phone numbers from strangers to call up their families, and 1 minute phone calls be like, are you okay? Your daughter's worried about you, and whatever, your family's worried about you, and then reporting back saying, this person is really taking us to 30, 40 years ago, pre-internet, even pre-international phone calls. It's been a really, really surreal time and very difficult, especially this divide between outside and inside. And it's just, we don't know how long this is going to go on.
And so in terms of your first question, if not Pahlavi, then who? If you study Iran's internal struggle for democracy, there is a very long and distinguished list of courageous, heroic people who've spent their lives fighting for democracy and human rights in Iran and have spent their time in and out of jail. Narges Mohammadi, Emadeddin Baqi, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Mustafa Tajzadeh, etc., etc. Heroic figures, just inspiring figures. I couldn't imagine me doing one iota of what they've done. And it's a tragedy that their names are not as well known as the prince who lives not too far from here and is living off the money that his parents took from Iran in 1979. So there's a moral difference there that I see, but that's just me. There's one last question that we got from our online audience. I'll pose it to the panel and then we'll end it there. It's a good question. Can you discuss the situation of the non-Persian people in Iran, the Azerbaijanis, the Baluchis, the Turkmen, the Kurds? Are they protesting? What are their hopes and dreams? Negar?
They're different. So the Azerbaijanis, the president is half Azeri, half Kurdish himself. And I come, part of my family is of Azeri background. They actually didn't join the protests early on. It only happened later. Azeris are the second largest minority. They're Shia. They're more integrated. They're very different. That the situation in Azerbaijan, very different than, for example, in Kurdistan, ethnic and religious minorities. There's been struggles for autonomy or for certain specific rights for these ethnic groups, Baluchistan, the Arabs, etc. But I think one theme that we can identify is that these sort of border or more remote provinces are even more impoverished. Like Baluchistan is the most impoverished, and that goes hand in hand with the ethnic minority struggles and sort of this fear of the central government of the threat of these border communities. Same goes for Kurdistan. They're at I think Dan mentioned, very porous border. There has been a small armed struggle movement that continues, and the central government really sees them as sort of a fifth column or as collaborators with the outside. Not everyone in Kurdistan, of course, is like that, but there's also legitimate sort of grievances and demands for studying in your own mother tongue, for your kids to learn your mother tongue in school, for having governors of Kurdish descent as opposed to the central government sending people, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a long struggle for various different minorities and ethnicities, and some of them are seen more as a threat and have been repressed and sort of suppressed by the central government. And we see that flare up every time we have these moments of mass movement. Mahsa Amini, she was a young Kurdish girl. And the protests for that reason really erupted first in Kurdistan with all of this underlying anger. And the government suppressed them to the point of they even wanted to ban the funeral for her. And then her community showed up, and then it started spreading like wildfire across the country.
Dan, last comment to you on the status of minorities in Iran at this particular moment.
Well, I mean, ever since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, but also before that, there's been this drive by the central government to impose its will on these communities and to draw and extract resources from them, and at the same time contain any sort of political threat they pose to the regime. And there's hyper paranoia about, maybe it's justified, about sort of outside interference in these communities, Baluchis, Kurds, and so on. But I think that one reason why one thinks about the possibility of a scenario if the regime falls, rather than necessarily seeing some sort of smooth transition to democracy, we see uprisings and possibilities of violence from communities that have suffered systematic institutionalized discrimination. And that creates a real possibility of the kind of, the very fragmentation that the government fears is a consequence of its own policies. I mean, this is the paradox, or not so paradoxical. So that's a real possibility. Iran, we're reminded here, is a tremendously diverse country and huge in its diversity and its complexity. And holding that together, quite apart from the problems of the fragmentation in the communities, in the expat communities and so on, holding that together under conditions where the regime is collapsing from within is going to be a real challenge when and if it happens.
Yeah, so we'll end on that note. This is obviously a very dark moment for Iran. It's a dark moment for our world. It's a dark moment for the United States. But, thank you both for coming here. Your analysis helps illuminate some of that darkness. And we plan to do much more programming in Iran because it's an important topic and it's not going away. And so you can find out more about our future programming by following our website or getting on our mailing list. Thanks for your good questions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.